first, I'm going to start with a recap of what we've already gone over. And then we're going to get into the rest of this. So we're going to start on page 47. And we're going to get into the spot where they're talking about him submitting the fake electors. And then we're going to get into the stuff with Pence. Okay. This is the most like outlandish and juicy part of the whole thing. And so that's what we're going to get into tonight. But first, let me go ahead and start for the people who are just joining with the history of how we got here, right? So let's remember back in August of 2023, that's when the first indictment came out from Jack Smith, who's a special prosecutor with the Department of Justice, okay? That's when we got the first indictment. Then Trump's team like appealed that, and they were going back and forth, and it made it all the way up to the Supreme Court. And it was argued in front of the Supreme Court on April 25th of 2024. Okay. And then it was decided on July 1st of this year. That's when we got the decision from the Supreme Court that the president is immune for official acts, right? And so they said it's got to go back down to Judge Chutkan, and she can figure out what's legitimate there. But first, Jack Smith had to go and get a superseding indictment, right? Because you can't move forward because the first indictment he got included all of the claims that the Supreme Court said he's immune for. Right? Welcome back, everyone. Laura is here. She's going to be helping moderate in the comments so that we don't have the weirdness that we've had before with the Trump trolls in the comments. So right now, I'm just giving us a recap of how we got here. Then I'll give a recap of the things that I discussed yesterday and earlier today. And then we'll get into, starting on page 47, the submitting false electors. And we're going to get into the Mike Pence drama tonight. It's wild, y'all. Okay, so remember the first indictment came out in August of 2023, argued in front of the Supreme Court, April 25th, 2024. July 1st, the Supreme Court said, president is immune for some of these things. You got to go back to the drawing board. Jack goes back to the drawing board, okay? He gets a superseding indictment, which means he gets a whole nother grand jury, presents his evidence without the stuff that the Supreme Court said the president is immune for. And he gets that superseding indictment on August 27th of 2024. So literally like a little over a month ago. Okay, then it gets back in Judge Chutkan's court, and then they set the schedule. Right? And then the first thing that Jack has to do is present this document that has just been unsealed. But because the Supreme Court's ruling was basically like, listen, you got to go and you got to show us the evidence. You got to show the judge the evidence that you're going to bring so that the judge can make the decision about what he's immune for and what he isn't. So that is what this document is. Jack Smith laying out all of the evidence. And so we started yesterday. And where we began in the document, the first thing that Jack Smith lays out is how the conspiracy was formed and when it was formed, right? Noting that before the election, they had already decided what they were going to do because they knew they were in the middle of a pandemic. Most Democrats were going to vote by mail. And that meant that on election night, the first votes coming in were going to look like Trump was winning because they were going to be taking just the day of votes. But as more of those mail-in ballots came in, day after day, Joe Biden might overtake Trump. And so they decided as a team that their strategy was going to be that Trump was just going to come out and declare victory on the night of the election. Okay. And all of that is laid out in this document on page 5 to 7. Sorry, I forgot to mention, if you haven't yet downloaded the document, you can go to my page and it's linked right there for you to be able to download it, and you can follow along with us. We'll be starting on page 47 for this session. All right, so the outline of how the conspiracy was formed before the election is on page 5 through 7. We went over that yesterday. Then the next section was about how Trump knew that the claims that he was making about election fraud were false. That's when we got introduced to Greg Jacobs, that White House lawyer who was really good about being like, hey, all this stuff that you're trying to say in the court. Thank you so much, Shannon, for the gifts. All this stuff that you're trying to say in court is garbage and trash, and it's not going to go anywhere, right? Like looking Donald Trump in his face and saying, there's no factual basis here. We also got the outline of Vice President, oh, I love that. Thanks, Nikki. Of Vice President Pence actually having these conversations with Donald Trump and telling him, we lost the election. Like, chill out. Like, let's call it an intermission. You can always run in 2024, right? Like trying to play to his ego and get him to accept that he'd lost the election, right? All right, and so that was all laid out on pages 10 to 15. And then we got into the actual fake elector scheme, where they outlined all of the different states and what happened, right? We looked at Arizona, where you had Rudy Giuliani on pages 17 and 18 admitting that they didn't have any evidence, but that they had theories of evidence, almost like concepts of a plan. That was on page 19. We had the intimidation of the Speaker of the House of the Arizona House of Representatives, right? That was outlined there. Then they got into Georgia, right, where they talked about the State Farm tapes and how they knew that they had been falsifying those tapes and cutting them up to make them look like something that they weren't. That was the case where those two black ladies in Georgia were, they sued Rudy Giuliani for libel. Or slander, excuse me, for saying those things about them. He was found liable for that, owes them millions of dollars. We also found in there that the campaign legal team was saying openly that they can't back up any of these claims. That's where we get the incredible quote where they just said, it's tough to own any of this when it's all just conspiracy shit being down from the mothership. Their own lawyer saying this in emails about their claims. That's also when we got the situation with the court case between Trump v. Kemp in Georgia, where there was a verification form where a lawyer and Trump as the defendant, or excuse me, as the person filing that, had to sign it and verify that the claims that they were making were true. And their lawyers were like, listen, this is when Greg came back and was like, you can't sign that. Like, that's illegal. People will get disbarred. And they signed it anyway. That alone is a criminal charge. This was also the situation where he had multiple phone calls with state officials who were directly telling him that those claims were wrong, that there was no fraud that occurred. Then we spoke about Michigan. We were talking about that earlier today on the pages 34 through 38, I think, where the Michigan Senate Majority Leader and the Michigan Speaker of the House were telling him, no, Wayne County and Detroit were not the actual issue, because that was Trump's claim, right? Like, there was all this fraud going on in Detroit, and they told him point blank, no. You lost educated women in Republican counties, and that's why you lost. And then he also declined to actually do a statewide recount of the vote, because he would have had to pay for it if it didn't come back that the results were different. And that's when we also got the Speaker of the House making that statement, right, that he was not going to overturn the election and do what Trump wanted to because, quote, he feared they would lose our country forever, and that it would truly bring mutually assured destruction for every future election, that he couldn't stand for that. Then we heard about Nevada, we heard about Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and then we got into the voting machines, right, with, what was her name, Sydney, who was on television making these claims about Dominion's voting machines. And we had the situation, the evidence of how Trump was on a speakerphone call with Sydney and was in the room with his boys and basically muted her and started saying she was crazy. that he knew she was unhinged, that the things she was saying were wrong. Tucker Carlson also said he had asked her for evidence that there was something going on with these voting machines, and she never produced it, and in fact told them to stop contacting her. But even with all of that, even confirmed that Trump knew that those claims were lies, he still got on television and said things about Dominion and said that they were causing fraud, and then got on stage at the Ellipse speech on January 6th and said it again. And so that's what we've gone through so far. And now we are picking up on page 47. All right. Again, if you want to follow along with us, I've got it here on this little screen over here to the right, and you can download the document from my page. Laura, thank you so much for being our mod in the comments. Please, people, behave yourselves. All right, let's get into it. The first thing we're going to talk about is what Trump did to submit fraudulent electors, and then we're going to get into Mike Pence. For folks who might be joining us for the first time, who don't understand what's going on with the fake electors, just for a quick download. The way the Electoral College works and that system works is that each state elects a slate of electors, right? One for the Democratic candidate, one for the Republican candidate. Depending on who wins the popular vote, that candidate slate of electors is then certified, and that's what's sent to Congress to be counted officially. And what Trump was essentially trying to do, what Jack lays out here, what he alleges, is that Trump and his team went around to the state legislatures and were like, no, throw out the duly elected electors that belong to Biden and put in this slate of my people, right? So that's what we're going to get into now. We're at the bottom of page 47, and we're in section D, and the title is "The Defendant, who is Donald Trump, organized and caused his electors to submit fraudulent certificates, creating the false appearance that states submitted competing electoral slates." All of that just means that Donald Trump, pressured the states and told them, no, use this list instead, which is illegal. All right. By late November 2020, every effort, both legitimate and illegitimate, that the defendant had made to challenge the results of the election had been unsuccessful. The defendant, Donald Trump, his campaign, and their allies had lost or withdrawn one election lawsuit after another in the 7 targeted states. Now we're at the top of page 48. And Donald Trump and co-conspirators' efforts to overturn the legitimate vote count through a pressure campaign on state officials and through false claims made directly to state legislatures in formal or pseudo hearings continued to fail. So, in early December, Donald Trump and his co-conspirators developed a new plan regarding the targeted states that the defendant had lost: Arizona, Georgia, Michigan, Nevada, New Mexico, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, to organize the people who would have served as Donald Trump's electors had he won the popular vote, and cause them to sign and send to Pence as president of the Senate certifications in which they falsely represented themselves as legitimate electors. Oh, thank you so much for helping us reach that goal, Nikki. Who had falsely represented themselves as legitimate electors who had cast electoral votes for the defendant. Ultimately, Donald Trump and his co-conspirators would use these fraudulent electoral votes, mere pieces of paper without the lawful imprimatur of a Senate executive, to falsely claim that in his ministerial role presiding over the January 6th certification, Pence had the authority to choose the fraudulent slates over the legitimate ones, or to send the purportedly dueling slates to the state legislatures for consideration anew. That's the end of that long paragraph. Let me just explain what that means. All right, so essentially what they're saying is Donald Trump and his cronies, his team, went in and told the states, actually, no, don't use this group of electors, use the ones that I have, right? And they had fake hearings with those people, fake sessions with those people where they thought that they were actually voting, and then basically forged documents that don't have the right signatures on them, and said they were going to send them to Pence so that Pence could then instead certify those fake electors, those illegitimate electors. And that is essentially what he lays out here. All right, let's get into the last paragraph on page 48. The fraudulent elector plan's arc and obstructive purpose is reflected in a series of memoranda drafted in late November and early December by co-conspirator 5, who is, let me get my list up, Kenneth Chesborough. For those of you who haven't been with me before, the list that I'm using was made by an individual who went through here and figured out who everyone was. Their jobs and titles are named, so it's really easy to find out who everyone is. They're just redacted for legal purposes. I won't be mentioning any like regular civilians. I'll only mention like politicians and people who work on the Trump campaign. All right, so the fraudulent elector plan's arc and obstructive purpose is reflected in a series of memoranda, so memos, drafted in late November and early December by co-conspirator 5, Kenneth Chesborough, as an attorney who volunteered to assist Trump's campaign in lawsuits challenging the election in Wisconsin. Beginning with a memo drafted on November 18th, Kenneth advocated that Trump's elector nominees in Wisconsin meet and cast votes on the date required by the ECA, which is like an election act, in 2020, December 14th, in the event that an ongoing recount in the state reversed the defendant's loss there. Right? So what they're essentially saying is, we've got all of this litigation out there. In case it wins, let's just have people come, have our electors come and go through the process so that we can have a legitimate slate if our legal challenges work. That's the initial thought. But this course of action, which Kenneth's Wisconsin memorandum presented as a contingency plan to preserve the possibility that the defendant's electors' votes be counted at the January 6th certification proceeding if he prevailed in the Wisconsin litigation and won the state, quickly transformed into a corrupt strategy to overturn the legitimate election results. Kenneth revealed this obstructive plan in 2 additional memos dated December 6th and December 9th. I need you to note there are footnotes here, right? So Jack is essentially saying he is prepared. He's got these memos and he's ready to like bring them out at court, okay? So we've got these additional memos dated December 6th and December 9th, which propose that the defendant's elector nominees in 6 of the targeted states, all but New Mexico, a state that Trump lost by more than 10% of the popular vote, sparsely referenced in his false claims of voter fraud and did not envision challenging at the inception of the elector scheme, that they all meet on December 14th, sign fraudulent certifications, and send them to the vice president to manufacture a fake controversy during the January 6th congressional certification. So what this essentially means is that at first they were telling people, hey, like, just in case we win these lawsuits, let's make sure that we have our electors go through the process. But then there were other memos from the same guy who hatched the scheme, who was like, that don't matter. What we're actually going to do is, regardless of what happens with this litigation, we're going to send this list of fake electors to Congress and give it to Pence so that he can, right, just say that these are the legitimate ones, right? They're asking Pence then to overturn the election. We're at the bottom of page 49. Okay. Donald Trump personally set the fraudulent elector plan in motion in early December, ensured that it was carried out by co-conspirators and campaign agents in the targeted states, and monitored its progress. By December 5th, the defendant was starting to think about Congress's role in the election process. For the first time, he mentioned to Mike Pence the possibility of challenging the election results in the House of Representatives. In the same call, Mike Pence told Donald Trump that the Georgia Bureau of Investigation was investigating their race. Now we're at the top of page 50. On December 6th, the same day that Kenneth put the plan on paper, this fake elector plan, Donald Trump and co-conspirator 2, John Eastman, one of Trump's lawyers, called the RNC chairwoman. Remember, we heard from her earlier. That's P39, Rona McDaniel. She's the one who fired the top RNC attorney when he started telling them, hey, none of this is legit. You've got to stop doing this. You're making us look stupid. And then Rudy Giuliani called him and was like, you need to resign if you're going to keep doing this. And then Rudy called Rona, and then Rona fired the chief lawyer. Okay, so this is Rona. This is who we're talking about. She's back on the picture, in the picture. So on the same day that Kenneth put to paper their scheme to use these fake electors, Donald Trump and John Eastman called RNC chairwoman Rona out of the blue. Rona did not know John Eastman, and Donald Trump introduced him to her by saying that he was a professor and lawyer. Thereafter, John Eastman was the primary speaker during the conversation. John told Rona that he and Donald Trump wanted the RNC to, quote, to help the campaign assemble the electors in the states where we had legal challenges or litigation that was ongoing, ... in case any of that litigation changed the result of a state so that it would meet the constitutional requirement of electors meeting, end quote. When the call ended, Rona immediately called P3, who is Justin Clark, who's a deputy campaign manager, and relayed her conversation with Donald Trump and John Eastman. After Justin assured Rona that the campaign was on it, Rona called Donald Trump back and told him so. Right? So essentially, Rona called a member of the campaign and was like, make sure you're doing that. And then he was like, we're on it. And then Rona called Donald Trump back and told him that that was happening. On the same day, from his personal email account, P21, who is Mark Meadows, the White House chief of staff, forwarded to campaign staff Kenneth Chesebro his November 18th memorandum and wrote, quote, we just need to have someone coordinating the electors for states, end quote. And the following day, on the evening of December 7th, Rudy Giuliani and P39, who is the RNC chairwoman, Rona, he sent her a text message stating in part, quote, I have lawyers assigned in each state working on December 14th electors meeting and what they need. I will send you a list. So this paragraph really outlines how it starts at the top. You've got Trump and John Eastman on the phone with the Republican National Committee's chairwoman telling her, what we're going to do is we're going to use these fake electors and we're going to send them through. She's confirming with people in his campaign that that is the case, right? And then you've got Rudy Giuliani working in the background saying, I've got lawyers on the ground who are going to be moving this forward. Now we're at the bottom of page 50. Donald Trump's co-conspirators worked with his campaign staff and used his pre-election campaign apparatus to execute the fraudulent elector plan. Donald Trump communicated with Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman about the plan, and they in turn communicated with Christina Bobb and Kenneth Chesebro. Ultimately, Michael Roman and P19, who is Liz Harrington, a campaign spokesperson, and other campaign staff and agents helped carry out Kenneth's plan. All right, remember, Kenneth is the one who came up with this idea. He's the one who drafted all the memos, writing out how they were going to do this fake elector plan. On December 8th, Kenneth Chesebro spoke on the phone with P53, who is Kelly Ward. She is the Arizona GOP chair, right? A private attorney who Rudy Giuliani and CC6, which is Christina Bobb, had identified as a contact for the plan in Arizona. Following the call, P53, Kelly Ward, the Arizona GOP chair, recounted the conversation in an email. And the email is here in block quotes, and I'm going to read from it now. I just talked to the gentleman who did that memo, Kenneth. His idea is basically that all of us, Georgia, Wisconsin, Arizona, Pennsylvania, etc., have our electors send in their votes, even though the votes aren't legal under federal law because they're not signed by a governor, so that members of Congress can fight about whether they should be counted on January 6th. They could potentially argue that they're not bound by federal law because they're Congress and make the law, etc. Kind of wild, creative. I'm happy to discuss. My comment to him is that I guess there's no harm in it, legally at least, i.e. we would just be sending in fake electoral votes to Pence so that someone in Congress can make an objection when they start counting votes and start arguing that the fake votes should be counted. It is absolutely wild to me that she wrote all this out. So she's basically essentially saying, Kenneth sent this email and she's outlining the entire plan, right? Even calling them fake electors, even in parentheses saying the votes aren't legal under federal law because they're not signed by a governor, right? And then outlines the vision of their plan. We're going to send this list to Congress and have them fight about it, right? So that maybe Pence can certify those, or they'll send it back to the states and let them fight about it. Basically, they're trying to cause chaos, right? My God. All right, bottom of page 51. On December 9th, CC6, co-conspirator 6, Christina Bobb, contacted P39, remember that's our RNC chairwoman, Rona, for assistance with a request from Kenneth, the guy who's been writing the memos, for, quote, a list of our electors in each state and copies of the certificates sent in 4 years ago. Rona, the RNC chairwoman, responded that campaign employees were already assisting in the effort and referred Christina Bobb to P3, who is Justin Clark, that deputy campaign manager. The next day, at Rudy Giuliani's direction, Kenneth, the guy who's writing the memos, generated manager. The next day, at Rudy Giuliani's direction, Kenneth, the guy who's writing the memos, generated manager. The next day, at Rudy Giuliani's direction, Kenneth, the guy who's writing the memos, generated manager. The next day, at Rudy Giuliani's direction, Kenneth, the guy who's writing the memos, generated directions to the electors in all of the targeted states except for Wisconsin, which had already received his memos, and New Mexico, which he had not yet been asked to do, on how best to mimic the manner in which valid electors were required by state law to gather and vote, along with fraudulent certificates of vote for the defendants' electors to sign. Right? Now, this paragraph is basically essentially telling us that they are going back and looking at the previous certified electors from 2016 so they can know what the documents are supposed to look like so that they can forge them. Right? That's what they're saying here. And that they are trying to figure out how best to mimic the manner in which valid electors were required by state to gather and vote. Right? Trying to understand what those rules are, along with providing the fraudulent certificates for the votes. Okay? Wow. Jack really did his thing. There's a lot of evidence here. This is crazy. All right. We're now on page 52. The day before the defendants' electors were scheduled to meet and sign fraudulent certificates of vote, Donald Trump asked his campaign advisor, Jason Miller, for an update on the elector plan and directed Jason to issue a statement. And Rudy Giuliani asked Jason to participate in a messaging conference call. Jason discussed these developments in a text thread with P3, who is Justin Clark, a campaign staffer. P54, this is the first time we're hearing that name. That's Hannah Salem. And P9, remember, that's Greg Jacobs, a lawyer who's usually been on the up and up, telling them that all of this is like not cool. Okay? After Jason proposed a communications plan for the campaign on the elector vote, then you've got Greg. He writes to Justin Clark and he says, quote, I'll call soon and we'll talk with the boss, end quote. The participants then discussed to whom a campaign statement could be attributed. P3, who is Justin Clark, wrote, quote, here's the thing. The way this is morphed, it's a crazy play, so I don't know who wants to put their name on it. Again, he says, here's the thing. The way this is morphed, it's a crazy play, so I don't know who wants to put their name on it. He's saying this is illegal. Who's going to sign their name to it and be held liable for this? P4, Jason Miller, then shared with those on the text thread the invitees to the call that Rudy Giuliani was convening. Now, there's a lot of redacted names here. So it's Rudy Giuliani, CC6, Christina Bobb, P12, who is Jenna Ellis, P19 is Liz Harrington, P55, that's on our other list. That's Boris Epstein, who is a Trump advisor, and then Cleta Mitchell, who's also a Trump lawyer. So Rudy Giuliani is convening all of these people, and he derogatorily referred to them. P4 does the derogatory reference, Jason Miller. He refers to all of them as, quote, the Star Wars bar, end quote, meaning a motley assortment of characters. And in this case, specifically ones whose professional competence Jason doubted and whom he personally would not choose to hire. Greg responds, quote, certifying illegal votes, end quote. Thereafter, the text participants collectively agreed that no message would go out under their names because they, quote, can't stand by it, end quote. In the midst of these text messages, Greg, Jason, and P3, Justin Clark, had a 19-minute phone call with Donald Trump. So what we're hearing here in this paragraph is that the day before they were going to bring all of these fraudulent electors in to have their meeting and sign their certificates, they're trying to figure out who's going to put out this statement that this is going on. But they're also texting back and forth being like, well, who's going to put their name on it? Because this is pretty wild. I can't stand behind it. Y'all are certifying illegal votes, right? That's exactly what Greg says in the text. And smoking pew pew here, okay? Apparently all of these text messages are going back and forth while Greg, Jason, and Justin are all on the phone call, all on the phone for 20 minutes with Donald Trump. They're on the phone with him while they are trying to figure out who's going to sign this fake elector scheme and put out this statement, right? Who's going to break the law? Who's willing to do that? We're at the top of page 53 now. In practice, the fraudulent elector plan played out somewhat differently in each targeted state. In general, the co-conspirators deceived the defendant's elector nominees in the same way that the defendant and John Eastman had deceived Rona, who was the head of the RNC, by falsely claiming that their electoral votes would be used only if ongoing litigation were resolved in the defendant's favor. What he's saying here is that they lied to these people. These electors who thought they were duly elected, who were coming there, they were being duped. They were telling them, we're only going to use this in a contingency situation. We're not going to use it for anything else, which turned out to be a lie. A select few of Donald Trump's agents and elector nominees, however, had insight into the ultimate plan to use the fraudulent elector certificates to disrupt the congressional certification on January 6th. In several states, Donald Trump, his co-conspirators, and agents were unable to convince all of the defendant's elector nominees to participate. P57, for instance, who is Lou Barletta, who was a former U.S. representative and a former U.S. attorney, and one of Donald Trump's elector nominees in Pennsylvania. He opted out of the plan, told the state party vice chair trying to organize Trump's electors that he would not participate because the plan did not follow the proper process and was illegal. When electors like Lou here declined, the conspirators and agents had to recruit substitutes willing to go along with the plan. Right? So what they're saying is some of these electors didn't know any better and they were being lied to. But then you had electors like Lou here, who's pretty with it because he's been involved in politics before, right? Used to be a U.S. representative, a U.S. attorney. He understands how the law works. And he was like, I'm not going to go along with this. This is illegal. And so he dropped out of the process. And when that happened, when those types of people declined, the conspirators and agents recruited substitutes, recruited new people who were willing to go along with the plan. Other electors who participated based on the conspirators' false assurances that their votes were only a contingency were later surprised to learn that they were used on January 6th and would not have agreed to participate if the conspirators had been truthful about their plan. Note this line here, that these electors whose names were used were surprised to learn that their names were used on January 6th and would not have agreed to participate. There's a footnote there, right? So that means at the very least, they have some sort of document, some sort of text message, some sort of email or memo, or perhaps they're going to be able to bring in these electors to testify at court to this. All right, now we're in the middle of page 54. Y'all excuse me, I've got two devices so that y'all can see where I'm at and then I can follow along. All right. In Pennsylvania, Donald Trump's elector nominees' concerns about the propriety of the plan presented a problem for the conspirators. In text messages that P5, who is Michael Roman, and Christina Bobb exchanged on December 11th into the early morning hours of December 12th, Michael told Christina that P46, who is Bernie Kerik, the state Republican Party chairman, whom Donald Trump had called shortly after election, quote, is winding up the electors, telling them that if they sign the petition, they could be prosecuted. Need a counter argument or someone has to call him to tell him to stop. Christine responded, quote, have someone who knows him call him to tell him to stop, end quote. Then Michael replied, quote, that's the plan. Pennsylvania is squishy right now. Going to need a call with Rudy Giuliani tomorrow. This is another smoking pew-pew, okay? Because they literally are saying that the Republican Party chairman in Pennsylvania, their concern is that he's winding up electors, that he's telling them that if they sign the petition, they could be prosecuted, which is the truth. Okay, and they're talking among themselves, conspiring among themselves, saying we're going to need a counter argument to tell them that that's not the case, or somebody's going to have to call the Republican Party chairman and tell them to stop it. And they say that the plan is to get someone who knows him, call him, and that they're going to check in with Rudy Giuliani. This is wild. All right, bottom of page 54. On December 12th, Rudy Giuliani, Kenneth Chesborough, the guy who wrote the original memos about this fake elector plan, and Christina, who was just texting back and forth about trying to get the Republican Party chairman to stop that, and others, they hold a conference call organized by the Trump campaign to placate Trump's Pennsylvania electors. So they're having a call to talk to the Pennsylvania electors who they think have been wound up and told, don't sign this, you're going to get prosecuted. In that conference call, Rudy Giuliani falsely assured them that their certificates of vote would be used only if Donald Trump succeeded in his litigation. Thank y'all so much for the gifts. Thanks, B. During the call, some of Donald Trump's conspirators and agents exchanged text messages expressing frustration at the electors' concern. P5, who is Michael Roman, writes, quote, whoever selected this slate should be pew-pewed. Okay? P12, Jenna Ellis responded, quote, these people are making this so much more complicated than it needs to be, OMG. And, quote, we couldn't have found 20 people better than this? Question mark, question mark, question mark. P5, who is Michael Roman, agreed, writing, quote, we need good substitutes. Thanks so much, Pip. When the possibility arose that the electors' certificates of vote include conditional language making clear that they were not yet the duly appointed electors, P5, again, Michael Roman, a campaign staffer, wrote, quote, the other states are signing what Kenneth prepared. If it gets out, we change the language for Pennsylvania, it could snowball. So basically, there is a Republican Party chairman who is calling up Trump's electors and telling them, hey, don't sign what the campaign's trying to get you to sign. That shit's illegal. Okay? In order to get around this, they're like, somebody needs to call that guy, tell him to stop, and now let's get the Pennsylvania electors on the phone. Thanks so much, Mela. They get the Pennsylvania electors on the phone, and they are asking questions, right? They are pushing back. They're trying to figure out if this is illegal. And while that is happening, you've got members of the staff. What's his his name again? Michael Roman and Jenna Ellis literally saying whoever selected these people should be unalived. These people are making it more complicated than it needs to be. We couldn't have found 20 people better than this. We need good substitutes. And then when the electors come up with the idea and they're like, okay, well, if you're saying that this is only conditional, please write that down on whatever it is that you want us to sign. Then they're saying, actually, the other states are signing the fake thing that Kenneth drew up, right? And if it gets out to the other people that we changed it for Pennsylvania, it could snowball. Right? This is obvious that they know what they're doing is against the law, that they know that this is not okay, and that these electors are illegitimate, and they're trying to lie to these people's faces and being upset when these people are asking legitimate questions so that they don't get caught up in any legal liability. We're on page 55. This is out of control. All right. On December 13th, the eve of when the electors were to meet, Donald Trump was preoccupied with preventing the certification of the electoral vote. He tweeted, quote, swing states that have found massive voter fraud, which is all of them, cannot legally certify these votes as complete and correct without committing a severely punishable crime. Everybody knows that unalived people, below-age people, illegal immigrants, fake signatures, prisoners, and many others voted illegally. Also, machine glitches, another word for fraud, ballot harvesting, non-resident voters, fake ballots, stuffing the ballot box, votes for pay, roughed-up Republican poll watchers, and sometimes even more votes than people voting, took place in Detroit, Philadelphia, Milwaukee, Atlanta, Pittsburgh, and elsewhere. In all swing state cases, there are far more votes than are necessary to win the state and the election itself. Therefore, in all caps, votes cannot be certified. Thanks, Hope. This election is under protest. Right? So again, this is December 13th at this point. And for y'all who've been with me the whole time, we've already gone through the evidence that notes that at this point, Trump knows all of this is a lie. He knows all of it's a lie. You've got the courts in Nevada who have struck down all of their claims. All the lawyers have looked him in the face. The guy who's the head of cybersecurity, thank you, Tara True, has told him flat out, like, these voting machines have not been a problem. We recounted 3 times in Georgia and all the numbers match the machines, right? But he's still tweeting this out the night before the regular legitimate electors are supposed to be certified. We're at the top of page 56 now. Ultimately, the Pennsylvania electors insisted upon using conditional language. Thank you so much, Halloween. Insisted upon using conditional language in their elector certificates to avoid falsely certifying that they were duly appointed electors. And in New Mexico, the state that Kenneth's memo did not even address, Donald Trump's campaign filed a pretextual lawsuit just minutes before the fraudulent electors met so that there was litigation pending at the time of the vote. Notwithstanding obstacles, Donald Trump and his co-conspirators successfully organized his elector nominees and substitutes to gather, thanks Joel, to gather on December 14th in the targeted states, cast fraudulent electoral votes on his behalf, and send those fraudulent votes to Washington, D.C. in order to falsely claim at the congressional certification that certain states had sent competing states of electors, right? So despite all the trouble, despite them, despite literally a Republican party chair telling people in Pennsylvania, don't sign that, right? Which is why that group of electors then made a conditional statement on theirs. They get all the people together in those states and have them sign these fraudulent documents that Kenneth has pretty much thought up, right? Wow. All right, we're at the bottom of page 56. And 56 is actually a short page because as you can see here, let me get you to the bottom of 56. All of this is just footnote. All of this is evidence that Jack says he's going to bring at trial. Absolutely wild. All right, so we are at the bottom of page 56. When possible, Donald Trump and co-conspirators tried to have the fake electoral votes appear to be in compliance with state law governing how legitimate electors vote. That is a really kind, polite, legal way of saying forged documents, fraudulent documents. Thanks, Doug. For example, the co-conspirators knew that some states required that the duly appointed electors meet and cast their votes in the state capitol building. To make it seem like they had complied with this requirement, state officials were enlisted to provide the fraudulent electors with access to state capitol buildings so that they could gather and vote there. In many cases, however, the conspirators and fraudulent electors were unable to comply with state law for legitimate electors. Thanks, Doug. For example, Pennsylvania law required the governor to give notice whenever an elector was substituted, but the conspirators could not arrange for the governor to give notice when Bernie Carrick and others opted out and had to be replaced. Remember, Bernie is one of those folks who was like, I'm not getting involved with this. Like, this is clearly illegal. Thereafter, CC5, who is Kenneth Chesborough, remember, he's the one who came up with this plan and wrote those memos, and others brainstormed fake excuses for their failure to follow state law, writing, quote, maybe we can use COVID-19 as an excuse for the governor not giving notice. Thank you, King Can. Right? So this paragraph is meant to show us that, right, they know that there's a legal process that has to be done that they're not following, but they're going to try and make it look like they are. And in the spaces where they can't do that, they're going to come up with excuses. They're brainstorming ideas about why they don't have the governor's signature or the notice for when electors are changed out. We're at the bottom of page 57. Then on December 14th, the date that duly appointed electors across the country met to cast their votes, and when Donald Trump's fraudulent electors in 7 states mimicked them, Rona, the head of the RNC chair, followed up with Donald Trump. When she received an internal Republican National Committee email titled, quote, Electors Recap Final, which summarized the day's activities with respect to electors and included a list of 6 contested states in which Donald Trump's electors voted, she forwarded it to Donald Trump's executive assistant, who responded, quote, it's in front of him. This paragraph is basically here to show us that Donald Trump was monitoring this whole process. He was being updated as this illegal scheme was going on. Rona, the head of the RNC, also called Donald Trump to tell him that she had sent him the update in the email. And she spoke to Rudy Giuliani shortly before Rudy Giuliani spoke to Donald Trump. So there is no doubt here that he knew about this fake elector scheme and was being updated as people were voting. At the top of page 58 now. Oh my God. At the same time that Donald Trump's fraudulent electors were preparing to gather and cast fraudulent votes, Donald Trump's co-conspirators began planning how to use the fraudulent votes to overturn the election results at the January 6th certification. On December 13th, Kenneth sent Rudy Giuliani a memo, another memo, that envisioned a scenario in which Mike Pence would use the fraudulent slates as a pretext to claim that there were dueling slates of electors from the targeted states and negotiate a solution to defeat Biden. On the same day, Donald Trump resumed almost daily direct contact with Steve Bannon, who maintained a podcast that disseminated Donald Trump's false fraud claims. Remember, Steve Bannon's already in jail. On December 14th, Steve Bannon's podcast focused on spreading lies about Donald Trump's fraudulent electors, including the false claim that their votes were merely a contingency in the event the defendant won legal challenges in the targeted states. Notice, what Jack is essentially saying is that they were executing a fraud on the American people right in front of our eyes, right? Because everybody knows these people are meeting. Right? And Donald Trump is getting updates that these fraudulent electors are meeting. And what they are telling people is this is just a contingency plan. This is just a contingency plan. Meanwhile, Kenneth, the guy who wrote the original memos, right, to cook up this plan, is talking to Rudy Giuliani, and he's saying, we're going to use this list. We're going to send it to Congress. We're going to put it in front of Pence and have him say that these electors are contested so that it creates chaos in Congress, right? Right, now we're at the bottom of page 58. On December 16th, Kenneth travels to Washington with a group of private attorneys who had done work for Donald Trump's campaign in Wisconsin for a photo op with Donald Trump in the Oval Office. This is just wild. Kenneth is writing these memos, planning this whole thing, right? And he's on his way to Washington to have a photo op in the Oval Office. Thank you so much, Nurse Science. During the encounter, Donald Trump complained about Wisconsin's Supreme Court justice who 2 days earlier had cast the deciding vote in rejecting Donald Trump's election challenge in Wisconsin. As the group was leaving, Donald Trump spoke directly and privately to Kenneth. Kenneth, the guy who wrote the memos, who concocted this plan, who has been running it in the background to get these fake electors to Congress. As late as early January, the conspirators attempted to keep the full nature of the fraudulent elector plan secret. On January 3rd, for instance, in a private text message exchange between Christina Bob wrote to Kenneth, quote, "Careful with your text on text groups. No reason to text things about electors to anyone but John Eastman and me," end quote. Kenneth responds, K. And then Christina followed up, quote, "I'm probably a bit paranoid, haha." And Kenneth writes back, quote, "A valuable trait." It's blatant. It's blatant. Okay, Christina is texting Kenneth, being like, hey, you might not want to be on the group chat talking about this illegal, fraudulent elector thing we're trying to run. Maybe I'm a little bit paranoid. And Kenneth's like, no, you're right. That's a good trait to have. It's outlandish. All right. Now, this is where we're about to get into it. And I will have to admit, this is as far as I've read. So we're about to be experiencing this part together. Okay. This is the bottom of page 59. And this is section E, which is entitled, "The defendant attempted to persuade Pence to reject votes cast by duly appointed electors and choose the defendant's fraudulent ones." All of this means is that Donald Trump was trying to make Pence use the fake electors, right? That's what this section is about to be about. Wow. I have a full list, Drewster, of the redacted names. Maybe I can put those also up on my page so you can download them as well. For anybody who's just getting here, the document that I'm reading from is on my page. It's up there in the link in my bio. You can click there. We're on page 59. This is new evidence that Jack Smith was basically commanded by the Supreme Court to present to Judge Chutkan so that she can make a ruling on whether any of this behavior that we're seeing here from Trump is an official presidential duty and thus immune, right? And so now we're getting into the section that actually might be murky because it involves Vice President Pence. As Donald Trump's various attempts to target the states failed and the January 6th congressional certification approached, the defendant and co-conspirators turned their attention to Mike Pence, who, as president of the Senate, presided over the certification proceedings. In service of a new plan to enlist Pence to use his role to fraudulently alter the election results at the January 6th certification proceeding. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Sanderson. The defendant and his co-conspirators again used deceit. They lied to Pence, telling him that there was substantial election fraud and concealing their orchestration of the plan to manufacture fraudulent elector slates, as well as their intention to use the fake slates to attempt to obstruct the congressional certification. And they lied to the public, falsely claiming that Pence had the authority during the certification proceedings to reject electoral votes, send them back to the states, and overturn the election. And that Pence agreed he had these boundless powers. They lied about that. With these lies, Donald Trump created the tinderbox that he purposefully ignited on January 6th. It is important to note that Pence's unwillingness to go along with all of this is why he's no longer Trump's running mate. And this scheme that they just outlined, right? The idea that Pence has the authority during this certification proceeding to reject these votes and send them back to the states. There is a recording of J.D. Vance literally talking on a podcast, and they ask him what he would have done. And he says that he would have sent it back to the states and let them figure it out, which is illegal, which is election interference. Okay, we're at the top of page 60 now. Let me move there for y'all who are following along. Donald Trump first publicly turned his sights toward January 6th in the early morning hours of December 19th. At 1:42 a.m., Donald Trump posted on Twitter a copy of a report falsely alleging fraud and wrote, quote, "Statistically impossible to have lost the 2020 election. Big protests in D.C. on January 6th. Be there. Will be wild!" Exclamation point. When Kenneth learned about the tweet, remember Kenneth is the guy writing the memos, he sent a link about it to another of the Wisconsin attorneys who had met with Donald Trump in the Oval Office on December 16th when they went there for that photo op, and wrote, "Wow, based on 3 days ago, I think we have unique understanding of this." End quote. Later on December 19th, Donald Trump called Pence and told him of plans for a rally on January 6th and said that he thought it would be a, quote, "big day and good to have lots of their supporters in town." Note this message, this tweet, this message between Kenneth and one of the Wisconsin attorneys, right? He had just been 3 days ago in the Oval Office, essentially telling Donald Trump about this plan and how they were going to try and use these fake electors, right? Because remember, Christina and him are texting back and forth, and she's like, "Please don't put anything about the electors in the group chat." Okay. And so now he's writing to this person being like, "Whoa, I think we've got some inside knowledge here. We know what's happening on January 6th. Bottom of page 60. Donald Trump and his co-conspirators recognized that Pence, by virtue of his ministerial role presiding over the January 6th congressional certification, would need to be a key part of their plan to obstruct the certification proceedings. On January 23rd, in a memo drafted with Kenneth's assistance, my God, he is the most memo drafted motherfucker. Okay. CC2 John Eastman outlined a plan for Pence to gavel in Donald Trump as the winner of the election based on the false claim that, quote, 7 states have transmitted dual slates of electors to the president of the Senate, end quote, which we know is a lie, and proposed that Pence announced that, quote, because of the ongoing disputes in the 7 states, there are no electors that can be deemed validly appointed in those states. John Eastman emphasized concealment, writing that, quote, the main thing here, end quote, was that Pence act without, quote, asking for permission, either from a vote of the joint session or from the court. Thank you so much, Friday. This paragraph is so incredibly important, right? Because it's showing us that Kenneth, the guy who came up with this, and John Eastman, one of Trump's lawyers, know that they're going to need Pence to do this. They've written down their plan. They're going to have Pence just use his gavel and say that Donald Trump is the winner of the election because 7 states have given us dual slates of electors, when we know that's not the case. We know they didn't have any governors sign off like they needed to. They're the ones who lied to those electors and made them sign these sheets of paper, and they think it's for a different reason. Thank you, OG. Right? And so then they want Pence to be able to say no electors can be deemed validly appointed in those states. And they go so far as to say the main thing here is that Pence doesn't ask for permission. He doesn't get a vote of the joint session or from the court. He should just do it on his own. They want Pence to overturn this election. Thank you, Michelle. We're at the top of page 61 now. CC2, George Eastman, his memo stood in stark contrast to concessions he had previously made about the vice president's lack of authority in the certification proceeding. 2 months earlier, on October 11th, he had written to a colleague, thanks so much for the galaxy, thank you so much. 2 months earlier, on October 11th, he had written to a colleague that neither the Constitution nor the ECA provided the vice president with discretion in the counting of electoral votes or permitted him to, quote, make the determination on his own. John Eastman knows fucking better. He knows that the Constitution does not allow for this. He's on record saying this. This is footnoted. Jack Smith is saying, I've got evidence, I'm going to bring it. Okay? And on top of that, we have evidence of him contradicting that, knowingly saying we should have Pence violate the Constitution of the United States and overturn this election. And just 1 day earlier, on December 22nd, when asked by other private attorneys to provide views on a draft complaint that would, if filed, have raised the issue of the vice president's authority on January 6th, John Eastman had recommended that the complaint not be filed. He wrote that, quote, the risk of getting a court ruling that Pence has no authority to reject the Biden certification ballots is very high. Thanks for the gift, Wix. Y'all, I'm sorry. This is the first time I've read this. So, this is very clear evidence of conspiracy, right? Because it's him saying, no, we don't want to go to the courts and get a ruling that would say that Vice President Pence can actually do this because we know he can. We know it is very likely that we're not going to get a court to rule in our favor here, because we know it violates the Constitution. And yet and still, this is their plan that they wrote down. Like, side note, what is it with the Republicans are writing down these crazy ass plans? This prior to 2025, it's like I'm glad they did, but don't put that shit in writing. Okay, we're at the bottom of page 61. On the evening of December 23rd, after Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman and Kenneth, our memo writer, plan with Donald Trump publicly retweeted a document called, quote, Operation Pence Card, which, like John Eastman's memo, advocated that Pence block the lawful certification of the legitimate electoral votes. Also on December 23rd, John Eastman emailed P42, who is Molly Michael, Trump's executive assistant, asking to speak to Trump to, quote, update him on our overall strategic thinking, end quote. The following day, December 24th, Donald Trump calls John Eastman and they spoke for 40 minutes. Then on December 25th, on Christmas, Kenneth, our memo writer, proposed in a text message to John Eastman and Christina Bobb that Mike Pence permit an unlimited filibuster of the certification in violation of the ECA and ultimately gavel in Donald Trump as president. When John Eastman asked, quote, is Pence really likely to be on board with this? Christina responded, quote, let's keep this off text for now. For those of you who don't know what a filibuster is, it's basically like you're just going to get up there and yap on forever until you pass the deadline by which the certification has to be done, right? So the Constitution says we have to certify these electors on January 6th. And I guess their idea through this filibuster is that Pence should just stand up there and talk about nonsense and not gavel in the electors and let it pass the constitutional deadline for this. And then John Eastman seems to be the only one here with some sense saying, is Pence really likely to be on board with this? And I cannot stress this enough. Our Constitution and our constitutional republic is literally a handshake. It is a gentleman and a lady's agreement that we're going to abide by the Constitution. And if Mike Pence had been willing to go along with this, they could have done it. That is why it is dangerous that J.D. Vance refuses to acknowledge that Trump lost the 2020 election and is saying things like he would have just sent it back down to the states to let them fight it out. Okay? It is individual elected officials choosing to abide by the Constitution that saved us from this, according to these allegations in here. This is fucking dangerous. Thank you, Joel. All right, we're at the top of page 62. Thank you so much, Nikki. All right. So John Eastman has just asked the group is Pence really likely to be on board with this crazy idea that Kenneth is putting out? And Christina is like, can we stop texting about this? Christina keeps asking people not to text about these things. At least she knows these things shouldn't be in writing. My God, what's going on? Okay, from that point on, the conspirators plotted to manipulate Mike Pence. Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Christina Bobb, and Steve Bannon worked in concert to enlist Pence to act unlawfully and to ratchet up public pressure from Trump supporters that he do so. Donald Trump began to directly and repeatedly pressure Mike Pence at the same time that he continued summoning his supporters to amass in Washington, D.C. Thanks so much, Mama Kay. On the day of the congressional certification, which is January 6th. On December 25th, when Pence called Donald Trump to wish him a Merry Christmas, Donald Trump raised the certification issue and told Pence that he had discretion in his role as the president of the Senate. This is wild. Mike Pence is calling Donald Trump to just say Merry Christmas. Donald Trump can't even take a break on Christmas. Still trying to steal our election on Christmas. Pence emphatically responded, quote, "You know I don't think I have the authority to change the outcome," end quote. The next day, Donald Trump tweeted, quote, "Never give up. See everyone in D.C. on January 6th. He also tweeted false fraud claims, quote, "Time for Republican senators to step up and fight for the presidency like the Democrats would do if they had actually won. The proof is irrefutable. Massive late night mail-in ballot drops in swing states, stuffing the ballot boxes on video." Remember, this is that State Farm video that he knows he's been told directly is a lie. Double voters, unalived voters, fake signatures, illegal immigrant voters, banned Republican vote watchers, more votes than actual voters, in all caps. Check out Detroit and Philadelphia. Remember, he's been told that he actually did better in Detroit in 2020 than he did in 2016. That the issue is actually that he lost educated women in Republican counties. Anyway, and much more. Back to his tweet. "The numbers are far greater than what is necessary to win the individual swing states and cannot even be contested. Courts are bad. The FBI and justice didn't do their job. And the United States election system looks like that of a third world country. Freedom of the press has been gone for a long time. It is fake news. And now we have big tech with Section 230 to deal with. But when it is all over and this period of time becomes just another ugly chapter in our country's history, we will win. Thanks, 10. This man just be tweeting out all kind of crazy stuff. All right, so we're at the top of page 63 now, after that paragraph of a tweet. On December 28th, John Eastman, Kenneth, our memo writer, Christina, the girl who keeps telling people not to put shit in text messages, they all exchanged text messages in which John Eastman expressed concern that Gomer v. Pence, which is a lawsuit filed the day before that asserted that Pence had discretion to choose electoral votes during the certification proceedings, would prompt a federal court to publicly reject and thus preclude the plan that conspirators were advancing in private. Remember earlier when John Eastman was like, actually, no, we shouldn't try and get a court to confirm that Pence has this authority because they're going to tell us that's not real. That's essentially what they're afraid of happening right now, because in this Gomer v. Pence lawsuit, someone tried to assert that that was the case. Right? And what they mean here by preclude, right? So if a federal court comes down and says, no, he doesn't have the right to do that, you can't go along with it, right? Preclusion means it's already been ruled upon and we're not going to talk about this again. All right. Thereafter, at 11 a.m. on January 1st, Donald Trump called Mike Pence to berate him because he had learned that Pence had filed a brief opposing the relief sought in Gomer, right? So basically, Pence filed a brief, his lawyers filed a brief in that case that they're worried about because they don't want the federal court to say that Pence doesn't have the power that they're trying to claim he does before January 6th. Pence files a brief basically being like, yeah, I agree, I don't have that power, right? And so Donald Trump calls him and is like cussing him out on the phone at 11 a.m. When Pence explained, as he had before, that he did not believe that he had the power under the Constitution to decide which votes to accept, Donald Trump told him that, quote, hundreds of thousands of people, quote, are gonna hate your guts. And, quote, people are gonna think you're stupid, end quote. And berated him pointedly, quote, you're too honest. Donald Trump tells Mike Pence, who is telling him, I don't have the power to do this, says, quote, you're too honest. Now, if that's not blatant evidence that this man knows he's a motherfucking liar and that none of this is legal and that he does not give a damn, I want a shirt that says you're too honest on it. This is outrageous. Okay. Wow. So Mike Pence and Donald Trump are on the phone. He's telling him, I don't have the power to do this. And Donald Trump is essentially threatening him, saying that hundreds of thousands of people are going to hate your guts. They're going to think you're stupid and you are too honest. Immediately before the call, Donald Trump had spoken separately to Rudy Giuliani from 10:06 a.m. to 10:14 a.m. And also Steve Bannon from 10:36 a.m. to 10:46 a.m. Jack is really doing this. Firefly, thank you. And late that afternoon, Donald Trump spoke separately with Steve Bannon and with John Eastman and Rudy Giuliani. Within hours of the call with Pence, Donald Trump reminded supporters to travel to Washington for the certification proceeding, tweeting, quote, the big protest rally in Washington, D.C. will take place at 11 a.m. on January 6th. Location details to follow. Stop the steal. Minutes after he gets off the phone with his vice president, who was like, I don't have the power to do what you're asking me to do. And Donald Trump is like, well, hundreds of thousands of people are going to hate you and they're going to think you're stupid because you're too honest. He gets on Twitter and reminds all of his people to be in Washington, D.C. on January 6th. Wow. We're at the top of page 64. The next day, on January 2nd, Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Christina, who keeps telling people not to send these text messages, they all appear on Steve Bannon's podcast. When Steve Bannon asked whether January 6th certification would be a climactic battle, John Eastman responded that, quote, a lot of that depends on the courage and the spine of individuals involved. Probably wink, wink, Mike Pence. Donald Trump spoke to Rudy Giuliani shortly after his appearance on Steve Bannon's podcast. Thanks, Gran Reed. That afternoon, Christina, the lady who doesn't like to text, worked to arrange a meeting among Donald Trump, John Eastman, and Mike Pence in order to enlist Pence to misuse his role as president of the Senate at the certification proceedings. When Christina texted Steve Bannon about the meeting, Steve Bannon, who had just finished a call with Donald Trump, reiterated that Donald Trump wanted Pence briefed by John Eastman immediately. Thereafter, Donald Trump called Pence, informing him, quote, that he had spent the day speaking to a Secretary of State, state legislatures, and member of Congress, end quote. Okay, there's a note here where they're referencing back how this conversation was described back on page 29 to 34. And the conversation is where Donald Trump spoke with the Georgia Secretary of State. And if you remember that conversation, that was when the Georgia Secretary of State was telling him that there had been no fraud in their state. Wild. Okay. On the call with Pence, Donald Trump said he had learned that a United States senator was going to propose a 10-day delay in the certification proceedings and told Pence, quote, you can make the decision, end quote, to delay the count for 10 days. Donald Trump then referred Pence to John Eastman for the first time and asked if Pence would meet with him. On January 3rd, Donald Trump again told Pence that at the certification proceeding, Pence had the absolute right to reject electoral votes and the ability to overturn the election. Thanks so much for the gift. Pence responded that he had no such authority and that a federal appeals court had rejected a lawsuit making that claim the previous day, right? So this is us learning that lawsuit that they did not want to happen because they don't want a federal judge saying that Pence doesn't have this power. Well, somebody did do that. And Pence filed a brief agreeing, saying he is not about that life. You don't have that power. And now Pence is telling Trump that the federal appeals court rejected a lawsuit making that very claim the previous day. We know it's illegal. We know it's not going to hold up. Then Donald Trump took to Twitter to again falsely claim that fraud had permeated the election. Quote, sorry, but the number of votes in the swing states that we are talking about is, all caps, very large, and totally, all caps, outcome determinative. Only the Democrats and some Republicans in name only would dare dispute this, even though they know it's true. The same day, John Eastman circulated a second memo that included a new plan under which, in violation of the ECA, this is our election law, the vice president would send elector slates to the state legislatures to determine which slate to count. Thank you, Nikki. I want to pause here and I want us to look at this tweet, right? Because if you were here with me yesterday when I was explaining what outcome determinative means, right? That is a legal phraseology, right? That tells us, while yes, okay, maybe we found that 12 people who had been unalived voted, those 12 votes aren't going to change the outcome of the election. To me, the fact that Donald Trump is now using the term outcome determinative, because let's be real, that is not a term that Donald Trump uses or just knows. That's more evidence of him speaking to these actual Secretary of States, these governors, and they have been telling him, we have not found any outcome determinative fraud. That's probably where he got this statement, right? This in itself is evidence that other people have been telling him there is no fraud. It's not outcome determinative. Wild. Okay. So then, now, because Pence has been saying, thank you so much, Wicks. Pence has been saying, I don't have this power, right? And now you've got a federal appeals court that just said he ain't got that power either. Thanks so much, Emily. Thanks so much for the gift. Now, John Eastman has to write up another memo because now they need another plan, right? And his plan now says that, okay, the vice president isn't just going to like take over. He's not just going to gavel it in and give the election to Donald Trump. Instead, what we'll have him do is send the elector slates back to the state legislatures. Send it back down to the states. Thank Fooey. And have them determine which slates to count. Right? Remember, this is the thing that J.D. Vance has been saying in public that he would have done. We'll just send it back to the states and let them figure it out. Let them hash it out. Thanks so much, Abundance. All right. We are at the bottom of page 65 now. The meeting that Christina, our lady who doesn't like to send text messages, had organized so that Donald Trump and John Eastman could enlist Pence to reject Biden's legitimate electoral votes was scheduled late in the afternoon of January 4th. In advance of the meeting, Rudy Giuliani, John Eastman, Christina, and Steve Bannon gathered at the Willard Hotel near the White House. And from there, Rudy Giuliani called and spoke with Donald Trump. We're at the top of 66. Oh my God, what are they going to talk about? For those of you who are just getting here, if you want to follow along in the document, it's linked on my page. You can just click there, download it. We're on page 66. Again, this is the offer of evidence from Jack Smith that was mandated by the Supreme Court that he present to the judge in this case so that she can rule on whether any of this is protected or immune behavior from the president. We're at the top of page 66. When John Eastman arrived at the White House for the meeting, P9, who is Greg Jacobs, remember him from the early pages. He's been the lawyer who's been telling Trump all along that all of this is illegal and none of it's going to stand up in court, right? So George confronts John Eastman about the legal basis for his proposal. George went line by line through John Eastman's second memo. George, Greg is a bad bitch, okay? And John Eastman conceded that no court would support it. In response, Greg warned John Eastman that pressing his admittedly unlawful plan would cause, quote, riots in the streets. I'm sorry, y'all. I had read the first 59 pages. So as we go, I'm learning this along with you. So Greg My dad's name was George. That's what's happening. Greg Jacobs, who is a White House lawyer, is sitting down with John. He's gotten this memo that John has written up where he's just going to have Mike Pence send the electors back to the state legislators and let them hash it out. And he's going line by line like we are now, showing him like all of this is illegal. Okay. And John concedes. He's like, yeah, no court is going to support this. All of this is lies. And Greg warns John. He says expressly, right, that this unlawful plan moving forward with this is going to, quote, cause riots in the streets. Greg then spoke to Donald Trump, telling him that the theory that John and others were promoting would not work and that John had acknowledged that it was, quote, not going to work. Donald Trump responded, quote, other people disagree, end quote, but did not identify those other people. Greg also pointed out to Donald Trump that John Eastman's theory regarding a strategic Democratic plan to subvert the election was inconsistent with other allegations that had been floating around about Dominion and foreign interference. Wow. Let me see if I can understand what that means. So Greg is telling Donald Trump that John Eastman, whatever this theory is, he says there might be some sort of strategic Democratic plan to also subvert the election, but that is not actually going to square with the other allegations that they're trying to say where Dominion, the voting machine people, were engaged in, that there was foreign interference there. It's like these things can't be true at the same time. All right, we're at the bottom of page 66. The meeting among Donald Trump, John Eastman, Pence, and Pence staffers, who is P8, Mark Short, who is Pence's chief of staff, and P58, who is Greg Jacob, who is Pence's counsel, began around 4:45 p.m. No one from Donald Trump's White House counsel's office attended. Oh, that's interesting. I think Jack is probably noting this because remember, he's got to be able to show that none of these are part of Donald Trump's official acts, right? So it's notable that he's with private attorneys and not White House attorneys because it goes to show that he is not doing this in his capacity as the president, but he's doing this in his capacity as a private citizen. During the meeting, the defendant, Donald Trump, asked John Eastman to explain his plan to Mike Pence. The conspiracy of it all. Okay. John Eastman presented two options. Mike Pence could unilaterally decide objections to electors, or alternatively, in the plan that John had devised the prior day and that Greg already told him is illegal, Pence could send the elector slates to the targeted states' legislatures to determine which electors' votes should be counted. In Donald Trump's presence, in response to Pence's questioning, John Eastman admitted that the ECA, which is our election law, forbade what he proposed and that no one had tested John's new plan to send elector slates to state legislatures for review. Nonetheless, Donald Trump repeatedly expressed a preference that Pence unilaterally reject valid elector slates. Y'all, all of this is footnoted, okay? He's going to have exhibits, facts, emails, timelines for all of this. And what this basically means is that Donald Trump sat down with John Eastman, his lawyer, Mike Pence, his chief of staff, and Pence's lawyers, and laid out this plan. And in that meeting, John says flat out, yes, this is illegal. We know that. It violates our known election laws, but we're going to try and do it anyway. And that, quote, Donald Trump repeatedly expressed a preference that Pence unilaterally reject valid elector slates, a thing that the federal court has already said is illegal. This is outrageous. We're at the top of page 67. I really, really hope we get a trial and we get Pence to testify because this is outrageous. Thank you, Kiwi's dad. All right, page 67, back to the text. Throughout this meeting, right, with Trump, Pence, their lawyers, Pence's chief of staff, Donald Trump repeated his knowingly false fraud claims as a purported basis for Pence to act illegally. Pence's 5 pages of contemporaneous notes from the meeting reflect that the defendant said, quote, "When there's fraud, the rules get changed," end quote. Another quote, "Bottom line, we won every state by hundreds of thousands of votes." Another quote, "This whole thing is up to Mike Pence." Another quote, "Has to do with you. You can be bold." Another quote, "You have the right to do whatever you want to do," end quote. The meeting concluded with Pence firm and clear, telling Donald Trump, quote, "I'm not seeing this argument working," end quote. Nonetheless, Donald Trump requested that Pence's staff meet with John Eastman again to discuss further, and Pence agreed. Listen, Mike Pence is a bad bitch here, because this whole thing here where it says 5 pages of Pence's contemporaneous notes. So there is an evidentiary rule, right? Where against hearsay, which is basically you cannot bring in statements that are made out of court. You cannot bring them into court to prove the truth of the matter asserted. And what that means is if you say outside of court, "Oh, it's raining that day," and I want to bring that statement in, I can't use that statement to prove that it was raining that day. I might be able to use that statement to prove that we had a conversation, maybe, right? Or to prove, to prove that we had a conversation. But I can't use it to prove that it was actually raining. Now, there are some exceptions to hearsay, right? And one of those exceptions requires, I'm trying to remember my acronyms from studying for the bar. My acronym was FANMAP. So as long as you have a document where you've written notes from that time, right? As long as it's fresh, accurate, and it's made and adopted at that time, right? So it's contemporaneous. At the time that somebody was saying something, I was writing all of these things down, right? So it's not like later, 2 hours after the meeting, I wrote it down, because then your memory can be faulty. But if we're right there in the meeting, I can write all of these down. And the exception to this hearsay is probably going to be admissions by a party opponent, right? So these are essentially things that Pence is going to allege and that Jack is alleging that Donald Trump actually said. And so any statement that the actual defendant has made, all of those can come in if they're an admission by a party opponent and you are able to show that you've got like contemporaneous notes and you can prove that they said the thing. So imagine Pence sitting there with Donald Trump and John Eastman, and he's just scribbling, writing all these things down because he knows this shit is illegal. All right. So now we've got record that Trump is saying things like, when there's fraud, the rules get changed. Bottom line, we won every state by hundreds of thousands of votes. This whole thing is up to Mike Pence. It has to do with Mike Pence. He can be bold. He has the right to do whatever he wants, even though we know that this is not true. And at the end of this meeting, Mike Pence looks at Donald Trump and says, "I'm not seeing this argument working." God bless him. Nonetheless, Donald Trump is requesting that Pence's staff continue to meet with John Eastman again to discuss this further, and Pence agrees. We're at the bottom of page 67. The conspirators were undeterred. Immediately after leaving the White House, John Eastman gathered with Christina, the lady who don't like to text, and Steve Bannon back at the Willard Hotel. Over the days that followed, these conspirators strategized on how John Eastman could influence Pence through the vice president's counsel, so the vice president's lawyer, and normalize the unlawful plan by discussing it on Steve Bannon's podcast. Meanwhile, Donald Trump continued to pressure Pence publicly. So now that they've gotten Pence in the room and he's like, "I don't see this working," now the next thing that they've concocted is they're going to try and get in touch with Pence's lawyer and try and convince him to normalize this idea. No, it's legal. You can do it. And watch us. We're on Steve Bannon's podcast saying whatever we want. It's cool. And meanwhile, thank you, WTH. Meanwhile, we've got Donald Trump pressuring Pence publicly. Thank you so much for the gift. All right. We are now at the top of page 68. There you go. For his part, immediately upon leaving the meeting with Pence, Donald Trump traveled to Dalton, Georgia, to speak at a political rally at the invitation of 2 U.S. senators engaged in runoff elections there. During his political speech, Donald Trump promoted many of the same falsehoods that he previously had been informed were untrue. He said, quote, "They're not taking the White House. We're going to fight like hell, I'll tell you right now." And remarked, quote, "I hope Mike Pence comes through for us. I have to tell you. I hope that our great vice president and our great vice president comes through for us, ... Of course, if he doesn't come through, I won't like him quite as much," end quote. He also used the Dalton campaign speech as a call to action to his own supporters, telling the crowd that, quote, "If you don't fight to save your country with everything you have, you're not going to have a country left," end quote, and demanded that his supporters take action to prevent what he falsely called, quote, "the outright stealing of elections like they're trying to do with us," end quote, and emphasizing we, quote, "can't let that happen." Thank you so much for the gift, KT. He knows Mike Pence has already told him, "I'm not going to do this. I don't see a way forward." He's already been told that the election hasn't been stolen. But he's talking to his supporters, telling them Mike Pence is the one who can do this, right? And saying that they have to fight like hell to save their country. Bottom of page 68. The next morning, on January 5th, Donald Trump spoke on the phone with Steve Bannon. Less than 2 hours later, on his podcast, Steve Bannon said in anticipation of the January 6th certification proceedings, quote, "All hell is going to break loose tomorrow." So they know. They know. Back to the text. Also, on the morning of January 5th, John Eastman participated in a federal court hearing in Trump versus Kemp. Remember, that's the case that's going on in Georgia, right? Where they're trying to sue them to overturn the election results. The Georgia lawsuit is against Brian Kemp, the governor, and then P33, who is Brian Raffensperger, the Georgia Secretary of State, who's been adamant that there has been no fraud there. They're the ones who've done that recount 3 times and are telling him that it matches the voting machines. So the Georgia lawsuit against those two, in which Donald Trump had signed a false verification days earlier. You remember that false verification and how that alone is illegal and a crime and grounds for like charges. And Greg, our noble White House lawyer, had told them about this already. John Eastman, on Donald Trump's behalf, asked the federal court to decertify the presidential election in Georgia and declare that the state legislature may choose the state's electors. During the hearing, the federal court denied the relief requested. So that just means the federal court was like, "No, we're not doing that." Now, I need you to understand, the thing that trial was based on was the false verification, right? They made this document, they put all these fraud claims that they know are untrue, right? And at the time when John Eastman signed them and when they had Donald Trump sign them, Greg, our noble White House lawyer who's been raising the alarm the whole time, was like, "Hey, somebody's going to get disbarred for that. That is illegal. You cannot do that." They did it anyway. They get in front of a court. They argue this. They are suing Republican officials of Georgia who have told them there has been no election interference. There is no fraud here. We've investigated it. And thankfully, during the hearing, the federal court tells them, no, right? You can't, as a federal, we're not just going to decertify these election results, right? And say that the state legislature can just choose the fake set of electors if they want to. All right, back into the text. We're at the top of page 69 now. Immediately following the federal court's rejection of the legal basis for the conspirators' plan, John Eastman went to the meeting that Donald Trump had requested that Pence's staff, P58, is that Greg? Yeah, Greg Jacob, Pence's counsel, and then P8, who is Mark Short, who is Pence's chief of staff, take. right? So after the federal court is like, no, we're not going to do that, John Eastman goes to have the meeting that Donald Trump was like, please talk to Pence's staff to get him on board. At the outset of this meeting, John Eastman changed his tack and advocated that Pence simply reject the Biden electors outright. Something he's already acknowledged with Greg is illegal. Remember, 3 pages back, he's already said this is illegal. This was contrary to his primary recommendation the day before for Pence to send the slates to the state legislature, but consistent with the preference that Donald Trump had expressed, right? So remember, they had all been in a room and they were like, actually, it's like totally illegal for Pence to just do this. How about, and a federal court already said it's illegal. How about we try, you just send him down to the states? But remember in that meeting, Donald Trump was like, no, my preference is that Pence should just overturn it and call the election for me. And so now we see John Eastman pressing Donald Trump's preference again here in this meeting with Pence's staff. Back into the text. John Eastman made additional concessions during this meeting. For example, John agreed that the Supreme Court would unanimously reject his proposed action. Consistent historical practice since the founding of our nation was that the vice president never asserted authority to reject electors. No reasonable person would want the Constitution read that way because the office would never switch political parties. No state legislature appeared poised to try to change its electors, and if Democrats were to claim the same authority, John Eastman would not credit it. Pence's staff expressed to John that Trump's plan would result in, quote, a disastrous situation where the election might, quote, have to be decided in the streets, end quote. Having failed to enlist P58, which again is Pence's counsel, his lawyer, in the criminal conspiracy, John Eastman told Greg here that the team was going to be really disappointed. The team, in fact, was disappointed. Jack's a little sassy here. Okay. After John Eastman updated Rudy Giuliani on the meeting, Christina confirmed to Steve Bannon that the Pence lawyer, that is Greg, was totally against us, prompting Steve Bannon to respond, fuck his lawyer. That same day, John Eastman received an email confirming what he already had admitted to Pence's counsel, that no chamber of any legislature in any state, including Arizona, Georgia, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, was requesting that its electoral votes be returned to the state for review. Wow. So essentially here in this paragraph at the bottom of page 69 into page 70, right, we've got John Eastman talking to Pence's staff and pushing these things that Trump wants, which is like just have Pence just overturn the election. And in that meeting, John Eastman admits the Supreme Court is never going to go along with this. This is not how our nation was founded. Never in our history has a vice president ever done some shit like that. And of course, we wouldn't have them do that, because if a vice president could just do that, then power would never change hands. It would never change hands. Imagine if Kamala Harris as VP could just be like, nope, we win. And then the next election, her VP Walz would just be like, no, we win. Right? It's nonsense. That's not how the Constitution works. And they know that, right? And you have, in response, Pence's lawyer telling him, yo, if you do this, this could be disastrous, right? The election would have to be decided in the streets. In the streets. They know that what they're doing is going to bring about violence. And then once they're rebuffed by Pence's lawyer, this motley crew gets on the phone, and Steve Bannon is just like, oh, well, fuck his lawyer. Out of control. All right. We are at the bottom of page 70. Meanwhile, Kenneth is back. Our memo writer, the guy who came up with this whole plan, or at least the one who wrote it down and spread it around about these fake electors. Kenneth who had traveled to Washington as directed by Donald Trump's public messages, obtained duplicate originals of the fraudulent certificates signed by Donald Trump's fraudulent electors in Michigan and Wisconsin. Thanks so much, Tara True, which they believed had not been delivered by mail to the president of the Senate or the archivist. Oh, wow. Okay, so now we've got Kenneth following Trump's direction that he should be in DC. So he goes there, he gets some copies of the fraudulent elector certificates. Remember, the ones that they've basically forged because no governor has signed them. They've lied to the electors, telling them, right, that, oh, we're only going to use this in case like the litigation goes our way. Right. And so he's got that stuff signed by the electors in Michigan and Wisconsin. But remember, those people believed, the electors believed that those things had not been sent to the president of the Senate, who is Mike Pence, or the archivist. They believe that none of that's been sent forward because Trump hasn't won any litigation around this. Kenneth received these duplicates from campaign staff and surrogates who flew them to Washington at private expense. Thank you so much, Hyacinth. This is wild. And note that they're talking about the reason they mention that this is at private expense, right? Like the government's not paying for this. The White House isn't paying for this. This is something that Trump is doing as a private citizen and not as part of his official duties, right? So the argument is that none of this falls under immunity. Thanks so much, Heather. Kenneth then hand-delivered them to staffers for a U.S. representative at the Capitol as part of a plan to deliver them to Pence for use in the certification proceedings. So this is like a whole backdoor deal. Basically, you've got Kenneth in Kinko's, right? Somebody's been in Kinko's making copies of these fraudulent elector certificates, right? That the electors have no idea are even in Washington or going anywhere. He got these duplicates apparently from campaign staff and surrogates. So actually, they were the ones who were in Kinko's making these copies, and flew them to Washington on their own dime, and then hand delivered them to staffers for a U.S. representative at the Capitol. Note that person isn't named. I want to know who that is. At the Capitol as part of a plan to deliver them to Pence for use in the certification proceedings. If you've watched any of the documentaries on Stopping the Steal or on January 6th, there's like CCTV footage of these fake elector documents, right? You can see people walking with them, taking them into the Capitol and that kind of thing. We're at the top of page 71 now. Donald Trump did not leave the pressure campaign to his co-conspirators. He redoubled his own efforts. On January 5th at 11:06 a.m., shortly before John Eastman's meeting with Pence's counsel, Donald Trump tweeted, quote, "The vice president has the power to reject fraudulently chosen electors." He knows this is a lie. And designate Donald Trump as the winner of the Electoral College vote. That afternoon, Donald Trump met privately with Pence in the Oval Office. During the meeting, Donald Trump once again told Pence, quote, "I think you have the power to decertify," end quote. When Pence was unmoved, Donald Trump threatened to criticize him publicly. Quote, "I'm gonna have to say you did a great disservice," end quote. This concerned Mark Short, who is Pence's chief of staff. This threat from Donald Trump concerned him, to whom Pence had relayed Donald Trump's threat, to the point that Pence's chief of staff alerted Pence's Secret Service detail. Next still, Donald Trump initiated a phone call with Pence, Pence's chief of staff, his head lawyer, and again, John Eastman, and one or two other private attorneys, likely including Rudy Giuliani. And again, raised the scenario of the vice president sending the elector slates to state legislatures. Pence's lawyer again pointed out that such a strategy violated the ECA, which are his election law. And Pence reaffirmed that he did not believe that he had the authority to do so. Shortly after the call that evening at 5:53 p.m., Donald Trump tweeted, quote, "I will be speaking at the Save America rally tomorrow at Ellipse at 11 a.m. Eastern. Arrive early. Doors open at 7 a.m. Eastern. Big crowds." Mike Pence and his lawyers have the patience of saints. This is like the third conversation at minimum where Donald Trump and John Eastman have been like, you have the power to do this, do this, do this, do this. And Pence and his lawyers just been like, no, we don't have the power to do this. This is illegal. We're not going to do it. And then Trump threatens him, right? That veiled threat. I'm going to have to say, you did a great disservice. And that in itself frightens Mike Pence's chief of staff so much that he alerts Pence's Secret Service detail. We're at the top of page 72. Y'all, we're barely like halfway through this. All right. Donald Trump continued his pressure campaign on Mike Pence that evening. After a New York Times article that night detailed the afternoon's private conversation in which Pence had rejected Donald Trump's demand to act unlawfully, Donald Trump directed P4, who is Jason Miller, his senior campaign advisor, to issue a statement rebutting it and approved the statement at 9:28. Okay, so basically the New York Times put out an article detailing the private conversation where Pence had been like, I'm not going to do this thing. And Donald Trump then was like, we need to get a statement out telling them that that's not true. Minutes later, Donald Trump called Pence and told him, quote, "You got to be tough tomorrow," end quote. After concluding the call with Pence, Donald Trump sequentially spoke to P1, who was Steve Bannon, followed by John Eastman. Then at around 10 p.m. that night, this is January 5th, I think, Donald Trump issued the public statement, which read, quote, "The vice president and I are in total agreement that the vice president has the power to act," end quote. A statement that Donald Trump knew was a lie from Pence's repeated and firm rejections of his efforts, but that gave false hope to Donald Trump supporters arriving in the city at the defendant's request and maximized pressure on Mike Pence. Mike Pence has been clear with him, even on fucking Christmas Day, that he does not have the power to do this and that he doesn't agree. And on the eve of January 5th, can you imagine? You've told the sitting president of the United States, I'm not going to do this. I don't have the power to do this. And he fucking gets on Twitter and tells everyone that you and him are in total agreement that you have the power to act. It's outrageous. And that is the conclusion of Section D. Remember, Section A, B, C, D, E. I guess that was E, Section E, that is about how he tried to pressure Mike Pence to overturn the election. Now, we're getting into Section F at the bottom of page 72. And this section is titled, "The defendant caused unlawful conduct on January 6th and tried to take advantage of the riot that ensued." I feel like that's pretty clear and pretty evident. Can you all just take a moment in the chat to thank Laura Mander? She's been here being a mod for me. We go back like years in internet time. So thank you so much, Laura, for doing this. She's going to be with us for like another 13 minutes, but could absolutely not do this without her. So give her a little love there. All right. We're at the bottom of page 72, and we're about to get into Jack's offer of evidence that Donald Trump caused the unlawful conduct that happened on January 6th, the day of the insurrection, and that he tried to take advantage of the riot that ensued. Thank y'all so much for the gifts. Thank you, Ix. Thank you, Clara. All right. Donald Trump continued his intense pressure campaign against the vice president into the early morning hours of January 6th. Around 1 a.m., Donald Trump tweeted falsely, quote, "If Vice President Mike Pence," he added him, "comes through for us, we will win the presidency. Many states want to decertify the mistake they made in certifying incorrect and even fraudulent numbers in a process not approved by their state legislatures, which it must be. Mike can send it back." Everything in that tweet was a lie. And he knows it. No state has said this. He's been on the phone with the state legislatures, with the leaders of those, members of his own party. Note, all of the evidence we have seen is directly from the mouths and experience of Republicans. There's not been a single Democrat witness, okay? Only Republicans. Back to the text, top of page 73. At 8:17 a.m., thanks, Jenny, as the supporters he had summoned to the city gathered near the White House, Donald Trump again falsely tweeted about the certification. Quote, states want to correct their votes, which they now know were based on irregularities and fraud, plus corrupt process never received legislative approval. All Mike Pence has to do is send them back to the states, all caps, and we win. Do it, Mike. This is a time for extreme courage, exclamation point. Thank you, boss lady. Later that morning, the morning of January 6th, John Eastman worked with another attorney for Donald Trump, who contacted a United States senator, thank you, Layla Nicole, to ask him to obtain the fraudulent Wisconsin and Michigan documents from the United States Representative's office and hand deliver them to the vice president. Who is this U.S. senator? This is where we're getting to the point, right, where they're naming some U.S. representatives and U.S. senators who have been involved in this, but like not giving us their names to know who they are. That's really interesting. So this is the morning of January 6th. John Eastman is working with another one of Trump's lawyers. They contact a sitting U.S. senator, unnamed, to ask him to go get the fraudulent Wisconsin and Michigan documents from the U.S. Representative's office. Remember, right? Kenneth had gotten those documents from Trump's campaign people and he gave them to a U.S. representative. These are those documents, and they're trying to get them to hand deliver them to the vice president. Thank you so much for those gifts. All right. When one of the U.S. Senator's staffers contacted a Pence staffer by text message to arrange for delivery of what the U.S. Senator's staffer had been told were, quote, alternate slates of electors from Michigan and Wisconsin because the archivist didn't receive them, Pence's staffer rejected them. Notice this is a lie, right? It's not that the archivist didn't receive them. Thanks so much for the gifts, y'all. It's that they were never supposed to go there and the states never submitted them there, right? Trump's team has made copies of these fraudulent documents and are moving them themselves, apparently through sitting members of the United States Senate and the United States Representatives, trying to get them to the floor of Congress, right? Outside of the rules of the law. Bottom of page 73. At 11:15 a.m., shortly before traveling to the Ellipse, which is where they had the speech, to speak to his supporters, Donald Trump called Pence and made one last attempt to induce him to act unlawfully in the upcoming session. When Pence again refused and told Donald Trump that he intended to make a statement to Congress before the certification proceedings, confirming that he lacked the authority to do what Donald Trump wanted, Donald Trump was incensed. He decided to reinsert into his campaign speech at the Ellipse remarks targeting Pence for his refusal to misuse his role in the certification. And Donald Trump set into motion the last plan in furtherance of his conspiracies. If Pence would not do as he asked, Donald Trump needed to find another way to prevent the certification of Biden as president. So on January 6th, Donald Trump sent to the Capitol a crowd of angry supporters whom Donald Trump had called to the city and inundated with false claims of outcome determinative election fraud to induce Pence not to certify the legitimate electoral votes and to obstruct the certification. Wow. I feel like that says it all, yo. He gets on the phone, right, at 11:15 a.m. before he's going to head to his speech one last time to get Pence to go along with him. Pence refuses, and he's like, okay, fuck it. Decides to add lines to his speech where he's going to go out there and tell his supporters, we're going to go with the nuclear option because Mike Pence won't do what we want. So we're going to get this crowd of angry supporters to march on the Capitol. Bottom of page 74. This is outrageous. At the Ellipse campaign rally, Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman spoke just before Donald Trump. In his rally speech, Rudy Giuliani sought to cloak the conspiracies in an air of legitimacy, assuring Donald Trump supporters that, quote, every single thing that has been outlined as the plan for today is perfectly legal, end quote, and introducing John Eastman as a, quote, preeminent constitutional scholar, end quote, who would further explain this plan. The bald-faced lying, y'all. They know that all of this is illegal. John knows. We got memos with him saying it's illegal. And yeah, he's a scholar of the Constitution, so much so that he fucking knows better. Okay, back to the text. He falsely claimed that legislatures in 5 states were, quote, begging to have their electoral ballots returned. Rudy Giuliani then asserted that Mike Pence could, quote, decide on the validity of these crooked ballots, end quote, and told the crowd, quote, let's have a trial by combat, end quote. John Eastman, in his speech, claimed that Mike Pence must send electoral votes to state legislatures for the American people to know whether we have control over the direction of our government or not, end quote, and decried that, quote, we no longer live in a self-governing republic if we can't get the answer to this question. The hypocrisy, the knowing subversion of our election, the knowing lying. I hope they all spend time behind bars. We're at the top of page 75. Trial by combat. This is fucking crazy. When Donald Trump took the stage at the Ellipse rally to speak to the supporters who had gathered there at his urging, he knew that Pence had refused, once and for all, to use Donald Trump's fraudulent electors' certificates. Donald Trump also knew that he had only one last hope to prevent Biden's certification as president, the large and angry crowd standing in front of him. So for more than an hour, Donald Trump delivered a speech designed to inflame his supporters and motivate them to march to the Capitol. Donald Trump told his crowd many of the same lies he'd been telling for months, publicly and privately, including to the officials in the targeted states, and that he knew were not true. In Arizona, he claimed more than 36,000 ballots had been cast by non-citizens. Regarding Georgia, Donald Trump repeated the falsehood that more than 10,300 unalived people had voted. And he raised the publicly disproven claims about fraud by election workers at State Farm Arena. Remember, the State Farm Arena is the video that they tried to say they made the Republicans leave the room, and then they were ballot stuffing, and then the black women were harassed, and they sued Rudy Giuliani for that, and he was found liable. And owes them millions of dollars still. We're at the bottom of page 75. Donald Trump made baseless allegations of unalived voters in Nevada and Michigan and false claims about illegally counted votes in Wisconsin. And in Pennsylvania, he claimed that there were hundreds of thousands more ballots counted than there had been voters. All of this has been openly disputed to him. Okay, we read through those pages together. He's spoken to the officials in those states, Republican officials who did this investigation, okay? And he's still lying. Donald Trump also lied to his rally supporters when he claimed that certain states wanted to reconsider or recertify their duly appointed electors. For instance, he said, quote, by the way, Pennsylvania has now seen all of this. They didn't know because it was so quick. They had a vote. They voted. But now they see all this stuff. It's come to light. Doesn't happen that fast. And they want to recertify their votes. They want to recertify. But the only way that can happen is if Mike Pence agrees to send it back. Mike Pence has to agree to send it back. In response to this lie about Pennsylvania, Trump's crowd began to chant, send it back, send it back. And now I'm even more upset because just earlier we were reading about these specific Pennsylvania electors, the very ones who one of the leaders in that state had been calling them, being like, don't sign this paperwork, right? Because it's illegal and you could be prosecuted. These are the people who Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman and Christina were on the phone with, and they were upset, being like, who selected these people? They should be pew-pewed. We should find better people. Fuck them. Why are they asking all of these questions? These are the people that Donald Trump is lying on in front of his crowd. Those people. The ones who did the most to be like, nah, you need to put a conditional thing on there that we're not trying to be sent to Congress on some bullshit. It's absolutely outrageous. We're at the bottom of page 76. Donald Trump gave his supporters false hope that Pence would take action to change the results of the election and claimed that Pence had the authority to do so. He falsely told the crowd that Mike Pence could still, quote, do the right thing and hawk the certification. And he extemporized lines about the vice president through the speech, including the indirect threat, quote, Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution and for the good of our country. And if you're not, I'm going to be very disappointed in you. I will tell you right now, I'm not hearing good stories. First, let's get another thank you for Laura, who's been with us all the way till 9:30 and is dealing with all the nonsense in the chat by being our moderator. We appreciate you so, so much. I'm sorry, I'm having an emotional reaction. For Donald Trump to get up knowing he's had this conversation with Mike Pence, okay? Mike Pence has told him at least 5 or 6 times, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going to do this. And he says, Mike Pence, I hope you're going to stand up for the good of our Constitution, that he is knowingly violating. Everybody, all the lawyers have looked him in the face and said, this violates our Constitution, and you are asking our vice president to violate it some more? Fuck out of here. It's offensive. It's offensive. I can't. Okay, we're at the top of page 77. Donald Trump galvanized his supporters by painting the stakes as critical and assuring them that history was going to be made, end quote. Donald Trump made clear that he expected his supporters to take action, telling them regarding his loss of the election that, quote, we're not going to let that happen, calling on them to, quote, fight and to, quote, take back their country through strength, while suggesting that legal means were antiquated or insufficient to remedy the purported fraud because, quote, when you catch somebody in a fraud, you're allowed to go by very different rules, end quote. Throughout the speech, from as early as about 15 minutes into it and twice in its final lines, Donald Trump directed his supporters to go to the Capitol and suggested that he would go with them. Thank you, WTH. The overall impact of Donald Trump's speech, particularly in light of months of statements and tweets falsely claiming election fraud and following on the heels of Rudy Giuliani and John Eastman's speeches, was to fuel the crowd's anger. For instance, when Donald Trump told his supporters that, quote, we will not let them silence your votes, we're not going to let that happen, the crowd chanted, fight for Trump in response. When Donald Trump soon after told supporters that, quote, we're going to walk down to the Capitol, end quote, that they would, quote, never take back our country with weakness. And that they had to, quote, show strength and had to be strong. Members of the crowd shouted, quote, invade the Capitol building and, quote, take the Capitol. Thank you, Clarissa. Thousands of Donald Trump supporters obeyed his directive and marched to the Capitol, where the certification proceeding began around 1 p.m. Minutes later, Mike Pence had issued a public statement explaining that his role as president of the Senate did not include, quote, unilateral authority to determine which electoral votes should be counted and which should not. Oh, give me a second. because there used to be a time in politics where we just disagreed over policy, but we were all aligned on the importance of our democracy. And for a Republican vice president, like I don't agree with nothing Mike Pence stands for except the Constitution, right? And except our democracy. For him to know, right, that Trump is going to turn this mob on him, and to still stand firm and say, I don't have the authority to do this. I don't have this power. Like, that's pretty incredible. All right, let's get back into the text. On the floor of the House of Representatives, Pence opened the certificates of vote and certificate of ascertainment from Arizona, consistent with the ECA, which is our election law. After an objection from a senator and representative, the House and Senate retired to their separate chambers to debate it. Again, we're getting a senator and a representative who are unnamed. And I am inferring that this senator and the representative are the same ones that were named up above, who were helping to pass around the fraudulent elector certification documents. It seems like that's probably what's going on. And then they got in the chambers and then objected. We're at the bottom of page 78. Outside of the Capitol building, a mass of people, including those had traveled to Washington and the Capitol at Donald Trump's direction, including broke through barriers, cartoning off the Capitol grounds and advanced on the building. Thank you, Jennifer. Among these was Kenneth, our memo writer, who came up with the fake elector plan, or at least the one who wrote it down and fucking circulated it. So among the people who are now on the grounds of the Capitol, pushing through the barriers, is Kenneth, who had attended Donald Trump's speech from the Washington Monument, marched with the crowd to the Capitol, and breached the restricted area surrounding the building. A large portion of the crowd at the Capitol, including rioters who violently attacked law enforcement officers trying to secure the building, wore clothing and carried items bearing Donald Trump's name and campaign slogans, leaving no doubt that they were there on his behalf and at his direction. Beginning at about 1:30 p.m., Donald Trump settled in the dining room off of the Oval Office. He spent the afternoon there, reviewing Twitter on his phone, while the dining room television played Fox News's contemporaneous coverage of events at the Capitol. Thank you, Leminski. The President of the United States told his supporters to march on the Capitol, and then went and sat down in the dining room across from the Oval Office, turned on Fox News, got on his fucking Twitter, and just sat there and watched this happen. At 2:13 p.m., the crowd at the Capitol broke into the building and forced the Senate to recess. Within minutes, staffers fled the Senate chamber, carrying the legitimate electors' physical certificates of vote and certificates of ascertainment. Next to the Senate chamber, a group of rioters chased a U.S. Capitol police officer up a flight of stairs to within 40 feet of where Mike Pence was sheltering with his family. As they did so, the rioters shouted at the officer in search of public officials, quote, "Where the fuck are they at? Where the fuck they counting the votes at? Why are you protecting them? You're a fucking traitor." To Capitol Police. On the other side of the Capitol, the House was also forced into recess. We're at the top of page 80 now. Fox News' coverage of events at the Capitol included, at about 2:12 p.m., thank you so much, Alicia, reports of the Capitol being on lockdown, and showed video footage of large crowds within the restricted area surrounding the Capitol. Much of the crowd was wearing clothing and carrying flags evidencing their allegiance to Donald Trump. At about 2:20 p.m., video of crowds on the Capitol lawn and West Terrace were shown alongside a chyron stating, in all caps, certification vote paused as protests erupt on Capitol Hill. Thank you, M. At 2:21 p.m., an on-the-street reporter interviewed an individual marching from the ellipse to the Capitol who claimed to have come to Washington, quote, because President Trump told us we had something big to look forward to, and I believed that Vice President Pence was going to certify the electoral votes or not certify them, but I guess that's just changed, correct? And it's a very big disappointment. I think there's several 100,000 people here who are very disappointed, but I still believe President Trump has something else left, end quote. And at approximately 2:24 p.m., Fox News reported that a police officer may have been injured and that, quote, protesters have made their way inside the Capitol. At 2:24 p.m., Trump was alone in his dining room when he issued a tweet attacking Mike Pence and fueling the ongoing riot. Quote, Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what should have been done to protect our country and our Constitution, giving states a chance to certify a corrected set of facts, not the fraudulent or inaccurate ones which they were asked to previously certify. USA demands the truth. End quote. That afternoon, at the Capitol, a rioter used a bullhorn to read Donald Trump's tweet about the vice president aloud to the crowd that was trying to gain entry to the building. Donald Trump issued the incendiary tweet about Pence despite knowing, as he would later admit in an interview in 2023, that his supporters, quote, listened to him like no one else. He's sitting there in the dining room watching Fox News, watching all of this happen, and decides he's going to tweet out. Mike Pence didn't have the courage to do what he needed to do. He knows these people have already breached the Capitol and that they're looking for him. We're at the top of page 81. 1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the Secret Service was forced to evacuate Pence to a secret location. Thank you so much for the gift, Pamela. For all of y'all who want to read along with me, because I see we've got some new folks here, you can go to my page, and this document is linked right there. We're on page 81. We're reading the 165-page document that basically the Supreme Court demanded that Jack Smith put out and give to the judge so that we can look through this evidence and decide whether or not any of these acts are official acts that a president should be immune for committing. We're at the top of page 81. 1 minute later, at 2:25 p.m., the Secret Service was forced to evacuate Mike Pence to a secure location. At the Capitol, throughout the afternoon, members of the crowd chanted, I don't even know if I can say this, hang Mike Pence. Where is Pence? Bring him out. And traitor Pence. Several rioters in those chanting crowds wore hats and carried flags evidencing their allegiance to Donald Trump. In the years since January 6th, Donald Trump has refused to take responsibility for putting Mike Pence in danger. Thanks, Darcy. Instead, blaming Mike Pence. On March 13th, 2023, Donald Trump said, quote, had Mike Pence sent the votes back to the legislature, they wouldn't have had a problem with January 6th. So in many ways, you can blame him for January 6th. Had he sent them back to Pennsylvania, Georgia, Arizona, the states, I believe, number one, you would have had a different outcome. But I also believe you wouldn't have had January 6th, as we call it. The fact that this man is again the Republican nominee for president is disgusting. It's disgusting. I'm disgusted. Wow. Just never take responsibility for anything. Okay, we are at the bottom of page 81. Sweet, merciful Lord. Okay. Rioters, again, many bearing pro-Trump paraphernalia indicating their allegiance, breached the Senate chamber. They're on the floor of the Senate, of our Capitol. rifled through the papers on the senators' desks, and stood on the dais where Pence had been presiding just minutes earlier. Notice earlier we were talking about when folks were evacuated, they took those documents, the legitimate certified votes of the electors, those pieces of paper. And if they had left them there, these individuals would have been able to get a hold of them and likely destroy them. Okay, that's how close we came. On the House side, rioters watched as police evacuated lawmakers from the House chamber, smashing glass windows surrounding a locked door that stood between them and the fleeing members and staffers. At least one rioter recorded video showing members being evacuated while the growing crowd screamed at the Capitol police officers guarding the locked door to the House Speaker's lobby. Pretty sure that's the lobby of Nancy Pelosi's office. Some of the worst violence of the day took place outside of the Capitol on the lower West Terrace, the side of the building facing the ellipse where Donald Trump had given his speech. There, scaffolding placed in anticipation of the January 20th inauguration created a tunnel leading to a set of double glass doors into the center of the Capitol building. After rioters had forced their way onto restricted Capitol grounds and past the temporary barriers, including layers of snow fencing, and bike racks, they attacked the law enforcement officers trying to protect the building. Thank y'all so much. Thanks, Joyce. With flagpoles, bear spray, stolen police riot shields, and other improvised weapons. Of his time defending the Capitol, one Metropolitan Police Department officer said, quote, "I feared for my life from the moment I got into that. We were walking into the crowd when the Capitol police officer was leading us into the front line. And especially when I got sprayed in the middle of the crowd, at that point, honestly, I thought, this is it. Yeah, multiple times. You know, you're getting pushed, kicked, you know, people are throwing metal bats at you and all that stuff. I was like, yeah, this is fucking it." End quote. The officer described that the rioters he encountered at the Capitol were wearing both, quote, tactical gear and, quote, Trump paraphernalia, and appeared to be acting out of, quote, pure sheer anger. We're at the top of page 83. In the years after January 6th, Donald Trump has reiterated his support for and allegiance to rioters. Thank you so much, Miss Tigger, or Tiger? I think it's Tiger. In the years after January 6th, the defendant has reiterated his support for and allegiance to rioters who broke into the Capitol, calling them, quote, patriots and, quote, hostages, providing them financial assistance, and reminiscing about January 6th as, quote, a beautiful day. At a rally in Waco, Texas on March 25th, 2023, Donald Trump started a tradition he has repeated several times, opening the event with a song called Justice for All, recorded by a group of charged and in many cases convicted January 6 offenders known as the January 6 Choir, and who, because of their dangerousness, are held at the District of Columbia jail. I had not heard about that. At the Waco rally of the January 6th Choir, Donald Trump said, quote, "Our people love those people. They love those people," end quote. Donald Trump has also stated that if reelected, he will pardon individuals convicted of crimes on January 6th. These people harmed the Capitol Police. They broke in, tried to overthrow our election. We're on the floor of the Senate. And Donald Trump is basically calling them hostages for being rightfully jailed for this. And that if he's reelected, he's going to pardon all those individuals. Just let them run free. Okay. We're at the bottom of page 83. On the evening of January 6th, Donald Trump and Rudy Giuliani attempted to exploit the violence and chaos at the Capitol by having Rudy Giuliani call senators and attempt to get them to further delay the certification. I've got to know who these senators are. Who are the members of the Senate and the House of Representatives who aided and abetted this shit? I want them named. At around 7 p.m., Rudy Giuliani placed calls to 5 U.S. senators and 1 U.S. representative. There's a footnote here, 486. I want these people named. All right, Christine's back. Christine, our Christina Bob, who doesn't like putting things in text messages because they're incriminating. She's back. She attempted to confirm phone numbers for members of Congress whom Donald Trump had directed Rudy Giuliani to call. In a voicemail that Rudy Giuliani intended for one senator, Rudy Giuliani said, quote, "I'm calling you because I want to discuss with you how they're trying to rush this hearing and how we need you, our Republican friends, to try to just slow it down so we can get these legislatures to get more information to you. And I know they're reconvening at 8 tonight, but the only strategy we can follow is to object to numerous states and raise issues so that we can get ourselves into tomorrow, ideally until the end of tomorrow." He then asked the senator to, quote, "object to every state," end quote. Thank you so much, Miss Tiger. Thank you. It's Tiger. I did it again. Thank you, Dr. Casey. Okay. He then asked the senator to object to every state to, quote, "give us the opportunity to get the legislatures who are very, very close to pulling their votes." This concession that legislatures had not yet asked to review their slates stood in contrast to Rudy Giuliani and Donald Trump's lies at the ellipse that they had already had. No, right? So Jack is essentially pointing out when they were at the ellipse giving their speeches, they were like, the states have already said they want to resubmit. They want to recertify. They don't want to submit these. Meanwhile, after that speech later in the day, while this fucking riot is happening, you've got Rudy Giuliani calling United States senators being like, just delay it, just object so we can have time to get the states to pull their legislators and try and recertify. The contradiction alone shows they're the fucking liars. All right, back to the text, page 84. Next, in a voicemail intended for another senator, Rudy Giuliani told more lies. He falsely claimed that Pence's decision not to use Trump's fraudulent electors' certificates had been surprising, and that in light of the surprise, quote, "we could use a little time so that the state legislatures can prepare even more to come to you and say, quote, please give this back to us for a while so we can fix it," end quote. Rudy Giuliani then repeated knowingly false claims of election fraud, including that non-citizens had voted in Arizona and an outcome-determinative number of underage voters had cast ballots in Georgia. They can't even keep their conspiracy right. They can't even keep the lies straight from one moment to the next. One moment they're in front of a whole crowd telling them the states already want it back. They've already asked to recertify. Now you're on the phone with senators being like, please delay so we can just have a little more time so that the states can ask for these things to be rescinded. Wow. All right, we're at the bottom of page 84. Okay. Although the attack on the Capitol successfully delayed the certification for approximately 6 hours, right? Because the purpose of the delay, as we just heard Rudy Giuliani say, is like, can we just get to tomorrow? Can we just get to January 7th? That's so that they can delay it beyond the constitutional deadline of January 6th to certify the electors, right? All of this is in a move to not have Congress certify that Joe Biden won the election. Thank you, Tanji. Bottom of page 84. Although the attack on the Capitol successfully delayed the certification for approximately 6 hours, the House and Senate resumed the joint session at 11:35 p.m. 11:35 p.m. 25 minutes before midnight. But the conspirators were not done. Within 10 minutes, at 11:44 p.m., John Eastman, who earlier that day wrote to Pence's lawyer that, quote, the siege is because you, all caps, and your boss did not do what was necessary, end quote. John Eastman emailed Pence's lawyer again and urged him to convince Pence to violate the law, writing, quote, I implore you to consider one more relatively minor violation of the EC, a minor violation of our election law, and adjourn for 10 days to allow the legislatures to finish their investigations, as well as to allow a full forensic audit of the massive amount of illegal activity that has occurred here. The fucking audacity. It's a quarter to midnight. On the constitutional deadline to certify this. And he's literally writing to Pence's lawyer being like, quote, consider just one more relatively minor violation of election law, you know, just adjourn for 10 days. For investigations that have already been done, the states have already done their investigations back in November and said there's been no fraud, okay? And a full forensic audit. I'm tired. All right. At 3:41 a.m. on January 7th, as president of the Senate, Pence announced the certified results of the 2020 presidential election in favor of Biden. So after all of that, we at the very least get these votes certified. Okay, y'all, that is, I think, the end of the evidentiary portion. The next part here is titled Legal Framework. So it looks like the next half of this document, I'm on page 85. The next half of this document, as Jack outlined in the very beginning, is going to be, thank you, Dilo, is going to be all about how all of this evidence does not violate the Supreme Court's ruling that he's immune for this, right? So what they're going to go over is outline the legal framework that the Supreme Court laid out in their case. And then he's going to show how all of the actions that we just went over are not a part of a president's official duties, right? So it is almost 10 o'clock where I am, and I have not had dinner. So I'm gonna take a break for tonight. And tonight I'll read through this legal framework so that I understand it. And then tomorrow we can pick back up and I'll give you an overview of that, and we'll get back into the evidence, because there is still a lot of juicy stuff buried in the document where they talk about Mike Pence and, thank you, Kiwi's dad, and Donald Trump's reaction when he heard that, thank you so much, Nikki, when he heard that the Secret Service had taken Pence to a private location for his safety, right? Responding like coldly with, so what? Thank you, Sue. Thank you, Jolene. So I will be back tomorrow with all of those details. Also, earlier tonight, some people were asking if I'll post my previous lives, because I think this is the third one. Did one last night, did one earlier today around 2:30, and now this one. So I'll be going through all of those as well and editing them. Thank you, Sandra, so that you all can rewatch if you missed something from the beginning, or if you want to share these things with others so folks can really understand the extent of the level of danger that our democracy was in, and the extent to which Donald Trump has showed himself, thank y'all so much for the gifts, to be willing to subvert laws. Oh, thank you. Those are pretty. I've never seen those before. So I will see y'all tomorrow, probably around, let's say, 4 o'clock should be good. I should be finished with all the things that I need to do. Around, let's say, 4 o'clock should be good. I should be finished with all the things that I need to do by around, let's say, 4 o'clock should be good. I should be finished with all the things that I need to do by around, let's say, 4 o'clock should be good. I should be finished with all the things that I need to do by 4 o'clock Mountain Time, and I'll be able to come back and go through the rest of this document. I'll also add the list of co-conspirators and all the redacted names. I'll add those also to my profile, so you can click there. But remember to follow so that you know when I go live tomorrow, so that you don't miss it, and you'll be able to catch it when I put the previous ones up, if that's something that you want to see. But thank y'all so much. Thank y'all for dealing with some of the nonsense in the comments. I really appreciate y'all's gifts and for sticking with it, because I've literally been sitting here reading for like 2 hours. But thank y'all so much, and I'll see y'all tomorrow. Again, if you want to read through this document on your own, it's linked on my page, and you can go there and download it and read it for yourself. There's a lot going on here. And if you don't want to read and you want to see some of this stuff live, I really do highly recommend the documentary Stopping the Steal on HBO. But y'all be blessed. Y'all have a good night. Please find a way to get active in this election, right? Before I came here, I was facilitating a phone bank. We made 91,000 calls, including some in Nevada. So please find a way to get involved. It takes all of us standing up for our democracy, right? In the same way that Mike Pence and these other Republican officials did in the face of pressure from Donald Trump and his conspiracy.